Smooth muscle is found in locations usually associated with your viscera or your internal organs, the squishy stuff. Smooth muscle is usually found in sheets surrounding these organs that need to change shape, and they need to allow things like gases and food to move through them. As pictured over on the right side of the slide, smooth muscle is usually found in two sheets surrounding the squishy organ. One sheet is oriented so that the smooth muscle cells contract, reducing the diameter of the tubular organ, but the other, more superficial sheet of smooth muscle has the muscle fiber oriented along the longitudinal axis. When this sheet contracts, the tube shortens in length, much like this inchworm here. The smooth muscle surrounding the bladder is slightly different than that, and we'll discuss how that works in just a moment. The anatomy of the smooth muscle fiber is very different than those of the cylinder-shaped skeletal muscle fibers. Recall that these smooth muscle fibers are spindle-shaped. I mean, what's a spindle? It's the thing that Sleeping Beauty cut her finger on. Up here in the picture on the right, these are actual spindles. In fact, that tool up there, that's how you take a big, huge bag of shorn wool and make it into yarn. I have done that, and I'd much rather pay somebody else to do it for me. There are no myofibrils, those cylinder-shaped contractile proteins in smooth muscle. And the arrangement of actin and myosin, it's not the same as it was in those sarcomeres. This also means that there are no striations in smooth muscle, as there are striations in cardiac and skeletal. There aren't any alternating I or A bands. Whereas skeletal muscle fibers were found in those groups that we called fascicles, smooth muscle fibers are found in sheets. And these sheets, they are innervated by an autonomic nerve, but that nerve, it doesn't form the neuromuscular junctions. It forms these bulbs that you see here, which are called varicosities. Inside the muscle fiber, actin and myosin are kind of like twisted around each other like a twisty tie. The actin fibers are attached to these structures called dense bodies that I have in the green dots on the picture on the right. These dense bodies, they're like anchors that are on the sarcolemma. So they're anchoring the actin fibers to the sarcolemma. The best analogy I have is think of tying your sneakers. You have the shoelace that's threaded through all the holes and crisscrossed over the tongue. So the shoelace is like the actin fibers, and all of the holes are kind of like the dense bodies. When you pull the shoelace, it tightens the entire structure. And this happens when actin shortens. It pulls on all of those dense bodies, pulling them closer together. And as that happens, each individual spindle-shaped muscle fiber shortens, and then the entire sheet shortens. Skeletal muscle had an optimum length-tension relationship. Smooth muscle does not. Smooth muscle fibers can get to a maximum tension pretty much whenever it wants. It doesn't have to worry about the cross bridges being detached or the Z lines being as close as they already get, because there aren't sarcomeres. With skeletal muscle, we were limited by the orientation of the sarcomere, right? Remember the analogy of getting my new home, and we had to lift the dryer, and I was too stretched out to actually even form a contraction. That kind of thing does not happen with smooth muscle. This is in part based on their ability to use calcium, in part, from the fluids around them. Recall that skeletal muscle takes calcium from its sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? It releases it, forming cross bridges, and then sucks it back up. But smooth muscle can supplement that calcium. It can take the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it can also take calcium that's around the cell in the interstitial fluids. And it's this never-ending supply of calcium that enables smooth muscle to have this long, slow, protracted contraction. Smooth muscle is also capable of expanding and then resting at a new length. And this is exemplified by how the detrusor muscle of your bladder works. As the bladder fills, the detrusor muscle that surrounds it stretches, accommodating the increased volume. And then the detrusor muscle rests at that new volume. Okay, so then you add more urine and it stretches again, but then it relaxes at that new volume. Skeletal muscle, on the other hand, had an optimum length tension relationship, and it was what we said was that skeletal muscle can contract even when it's about 70% of its original length, or even when it's about 130% of its original length. Smooth muscle, like the detrusor muscle, has a capability that's somewhere between like 10 and 180%. So basically, the detrusor muscle can contract whenever it really wants to. I also want to point out that for you to hold one of your skeletal muscles in place, you have to continue to apply tension to it with an action potential from your brain. But with a smooth muscle, once it expands to its new length, it can rest. It doesn't have to maintain or hold tension. Smooth muscle is commonly found in sheets of those spindle-shaped cells, and these sheets surround almost all of your squishy organs. We said that there are two sheets, one longitudinally arranged to shorten the organ upon contraction, and one circularly arranged in order to decrease the diameter upon contraction, or length or width. Most of these visceral sheets are controlled by your autonomic nervous system, which also makes sense because smooth muscle, as we know, is involuntary. Most of these sheets have the capability of responding to hormones, which is simply just another form of control over organs as opposed to nervous system control. Scattered throughout your body are individual smooth muscle fibers that all act together, despite the fact that they are separated by a very large distance. These would be called multi-unit smooth muscle fibers, and they are only capable of being stimulated by the nervous system. They have no response to hormones as we know it right now. Two examples of this are the eye muscles and also the muscles that control the root hair plexuses. All right, so let's do eye muscles first. You have two eyes, or you might not actually, but you may have at some point had the muscles that surround the eyes, like the ocular motor. And this type of muscle is controlled by a cranial nerve. And that cranial nerve pair controls the ocular motor nerves the same way on the left and the right. So even though they're separated by distance, the same thing happens to them at the same time. In discussing root hairs, we talked about how these smooth muscle fibers here, which are called arrector pili, are connected to all of the bulbs of hair follicles. We also talked about the phenomenon that some people might say, whoo, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, especially when you get like frightened or startled. All of those hairs, each one of those hairs, they're all controlled by an individual smooth muscle fiber called an arrector pili. And these smooth muscle fibers, they are scattered and separated by location, but they have the same control.